Welcome, everyone. This is our new webinar series being run from the ARDC and the Open Ecoacoustics project. My name's Paul Rowe. I've recently moved to James Cook University, and this is our new webinar series. And this first one is going to be about real-world applications insights. We're going to be asking for sort of feedback and things since this is sort of new, sort of further down the track. But I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we currently are. In this case, in Brisbane, it's the Turrbal and Yugara people. They're the First Nations owners of the lands. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. Recognise that these lands have always been places of science, teaching, research, and learning, and the First Nations owners have always been custodians of the lands and sea. And to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play in the community here and our broader ecoacoustics community. So this is a new thing for us. We're very excited to be doing this. In the past, we've run a number of sort of in-person events, and there are more in-person events happening in Western Australia this year. But given that ecoacoustics really is taking off now, we thought that it'd be nice to have a more frequent and a more sort of accessible way of sharing information about ecoacoustics and being able to sort of build the community. So we're very much about being open, about sort of open science, about sharing sort of knowledge and expertise. We've invited some great speakers to come along today. These events, these webinars are designed to be kind of quite short and focused, so they shouldn't sort of take a lot of your time. We've got a few sort of quick sort of talks, and then half of the time will be kept for sort of discussion, and we'll be sort of seeking sort of information at the end. So we're really about working with the community. We want to sort of build the community so that we can use ecoacoustics to actually further real-world conservation in Australia and more generally in the world. So this is the schedule we've got today. We've got a set of lightning talks. So these are just 10-minute talks. We've got Lola from QUT, who's going to be talking about some of her work with Pink Cockatoos. We've got Slade from JCU and Karen Rowe from the Museums of Victoria. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Nelli, who's going to introduce each of the speakers. Speakers will speak for in total about half an hour, and I think Andy's going to be quite strict with the timekeeping to ensure that we've got a good sort of 20 minutes or more for sort of discussion and questions, and so that we can actually sort of finish on time. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm now going to hand over to Nelli.
Hi everyone, I'm Nelli Holopainen. I'm the project manager in the Open Ecoacoustics project. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Lola Lange. She's a PhD student at QUT, and she uses ecoacoustics to explore how biodiversity responds to environmental variation. She has current work, fieldwork based in Springbrook National Park, and today she'll share insights from her research on the endangered Pink Cockatoo. And she'll highlight how acoustic monitoring can inform conservation in Australia's dryland ecosystems. So Lola, please, oh, sorry about that. Please take over.
Let me share my screen.
Yes.
Can everyone see?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, let me just move this over here. Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nelly, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about how we used ecoacoustics to understand habitat use of the pink cockatoo. Oh. Very quickly, the pink cockatoo is an endemic parrot to Australia, lives in semi-arid and arid regions, usually dry woodlands. There are two subspecies, the eastern and the western subspecies, but for this project, we mainly focused on the eastern subspecies. As we all know, climate change and land clearing are some of the main drivers of biodiversity decline. This is exacerbated for species that already live in harsh environments, such as the arid and semi-arid regions. especially species that are dependent in hollow-bearing trees from Renman vegetation. The eastern pink cockatoo is one of the species that's been highly affected by these, and in March of 2023 was listed endangered. Despite being one of the most iconic Australian birds, I'm a bit biased, there's very few research that's been done on the pink cockatoo. There's a few government reports in Victoria by Hurley and Harris, and there's 2 papers in WA by Rowley and Chapman. To effectively conserve the species, we need a better understanding of its habitat use and ecological requirements in these regions. There hasn't been any research done in Queensland and New South Wales. So in this project, I aimed to answer 2 main questions. The first one was just the activity of pink cockatoos varies according to different vegetation types, and the second one was focused on the changes of activity depending on changes on temperature and rainfall. For this talk, I will only discuss the first question. Does the spatial distribution of pink cockatoos vary across different vegetation types in the Mulga bioregion? So this part of our study was based at the Barra Wildlife Sanctuary, managed by the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, the AWC. The sanctuary is in Cunnamulla, 10-hour drive west of Brisbane. Studying these species using traditional methods would be extremely hard due to the remoteness and difficulty of access of the site. So we deployed 22 audio moth sensors. The distribution of the sensors was based on covering most of the vegetation types in Barra. We aimed to have around 3 sensors per vegetation type, and we wanted to cover most of the sanctuary. The sensors were set to record 7 to 10 in the morning and 4:30 to 5:30 in the afternoon. These timeframes were selected based on previous recording of the pink cockatoos in the sanctuary, and given the remote location of Barra, we focus on these high detection windows to optimize the battery life and memory capacity of the SD cards. And we service these sensors every 8 weeks. We also used 4 solar bus sensors from the Australian Acoustic Observatory, which are permanently set and continuously recording, but we only use the same 4 hours as per the audio moth design. This gave us a total of around 19,000 hours of recording. It would have been impossible to manually go and check each of these recordings for pink cockatoos, so we used an AI recognizer developed by Lance Devine from QUT that we trained for pink cockatoo calls. This is an example of the recognizer output when entered into the Raven software. The little squares, rectangles that you see there is the output of the recognizer, and I'm quickly going to show you. This is what they sound like. They're quite loud. I will quickly run through these maps. There's not a lot of time, but it's interesting to see the variation of activity across time and location. The size of the circle indicates the amount of activity of the pink cockatoo, and the color is the vegetation type. So you can see here in May and June, they're mostly in a Coolabah site. In July and August, there's quite a bit less activity, but still predominantly Coolabah sites. By September, the activity shifted into a cypress habitat. We have been seeing the pink cockatoos foraging on these trees. In the slide, you can see the little seeds, fruits that they've been chewing on. And there's also some activity in the Mulga and the Gidgee sites. By October, there's not a lot of activity in the sanctuary. And in November, the most active site was a river redgum. What I wanted to illustrate by showing these maps is that the pink cockatoos are using most of the sanctuary depending on the time of the year, probably looking for using different vegetations for food and hollows. But this illustrates the importance of the heterogeneity of the landscape for these birds. The biggest factor influencing the pink cockatoo activity is distance to permanent water. The less distance to water, the highest pink cockatoo activity that we found. This is very common in arid birds, especially in times of drought, but particular for this species. In the research papers in WA, they found that pink cockatoos remain really close to the breeding site until all the fledglings are ready to leave the hollow. So they usually choose breeding sites close to water and food sources. The river red gum coolabah vegetation was also one of the most important factors, and also the large DBH. The width of the tree also came up as significant for pink cockatoo activity. This is likely because older, larger trees are more likely to contain hollows. Another very important finding of this project was the first recorded hollow in the sanctuary, which was found after going to the hotspot obtained from analysis of the recordings. In this map, you can see there's a permanent water source, there's cypress trees, which they use for food, and there's coolabah and river red gum trees, which are suitable for hollows. These findings highlight the critical role of riparian zones for these birds, which not only provide reliable water, but also support key habitat features like large hollow-bearing trees and abundant foraging resources. By the end of the project, we ended up finding 2 more hollows, which were also found near permanent water sources. So to end, using ecoacoustic sensors for 4 hours during 6 months, we were able to uncover key patterns in pink cockatoo habitat use, highlighting the importance of riparian zone, large trees, and landscape heterogeneity. With permanent acoustic sensors recording continuously, like the A2O, we can study seasonal shifts, detect responses to extreme climate events, capture key breeding behaviors, and with advances in AI, ecoacoustics is rapidly becoming an accessible and scalable tool for monitoring biodiversity. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much. I'm giving you a little applause. Thank you for your talk. And we can move to our next speaker, who is Dr. Slade Allen-Ankins. He's a postdoctoral researcher at James Cook University, and he works on techniques and approaches for using acoustics to monitor vertebrates in many settings. So please take over, Slade.
Thank you, Nelli. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So yes, my name's Slade Allen-Ankins. I'm a researcher at James Cook University in Lynn Schwartzkopf's lab. And I just want to talk today about a couple of projects that we've been working on using acoustics, particularly around detecting threatened and introduced species in audio recordings. Okay, so the first project that I want to talk about is looking for threatened species in the Australian Acoustic Observatory, or the A2O. For those of you who haven't heard of this before, this is a countrywide network of acoustic sensors that was first deployed in 2019. There's at least 63 sites currently collecting data, with more coming. And these recorders collect audio 24/7. So there's 4 sensors at each site around the country, and they've been placed out in various habitats all around. And they weren't put out to monitor any particular species. They weren't put out specifically to monitor threatened species. But given the large number of sensors and the wide range of habitats that they occur in, an obvious question is that can they be useful for monitoring threatened species? So last year we had a look at that. We just did a desktop study looking at the distribution and of predicted habitat for threatened species, and we found that there were potentially over 100 vocal threatened vertebrate species that we could monitor at these sites, with some sites potentially having 20, 30, maybe even 40 threatened species that could occur at those locations, and all of the sites had the potential to monitor at least one. But of course, this was a very broad scale look at that question. Specific sensors might not be in the right location or the right habitat to actually get any of these species. And of course, the particular species may not occur all across their distribution. So while there's a lot of potential there, we still didn't really know which threatened species we may be able to monitor with acoustics. And so that's what we've set out to do in a recent project. And to do that, we've used 2 different methods to try to detect threatened species. Both relying on BirdNet, the deep learning model to predict bird sounds. So the latest version of BirdNet has over 6,500 sound classes in it, and that includes a lot of Australian species now. And that includes some of our threatened species. So the intention was to use BirdNet for those threatened species that already exist within the model and do an evaluation of how well it works. But we also wanted to try and detect species that were outside that model. And to do that, we used an approach called embedding search, and we used BirdNet for that as well. And essentially, we can use an example call to search for similar sounds within a large data set. And the idea is that if that species is present, we should be able to identify which sounds we should listen to identify that species. And I'll just talk about that in a little bit more detail, just because I think this technique might not be commonly encountered by people. To do this embedding search, we need an example vocalization of the threatened species we want to target. And this is particularly useful, I think, for threatened species because we often don't have a large data set of example calls to work with to train a recognizer. And so you can pass just a single vocalization through a model like BirdNet and get an embeddings representation of that sound. So that's how BirdNet essentially represents that sound. And then if we have a large data set like we have with the A2O that we want to search for that species, we can also pass all that audio through the same model and get embeddings vectors for every 3 seconds of that data set. And then we can measure the similarity between the embeddings of our example and all this unknown audio to try to find the species of interest. So we can just rank the entire data set by its similarity to that sound, and then we can listen to the sounds that are most similar. And if that species is present at a site, the expectation is that's where we would hopefully be able to detect them. So we've done this process for 76 threatened vocal vertebrates, 58 birds, 13 frogs, and 5 mammals. 34 of the bird species that we chose are just already in BirdNet, and so for that we used BirdNet to run over those sites and then validated detections out of that model. And for the remaining 24 birds, as well as all of the frogs and mammals, we use the embedding search approach. So we've got an example call for that species, and we use that method I just described. And so we've recently finished up the validation of this, and we processed over 2 million hours of acoustic recordings across the A2O. So we had 63 sites that we processed, and we processed all the data that was available at the time that we were doing this analysis. And we managed to detect 43 out of the 76 species that we chose to target, which I think is a pretty huge number. Like I said before, many of these sensors are not put out in the specific habitat required for any of these particular species. And of course, the threatened species, may not occur all across their distribution, which was sort of our decision-making about which species and which sites to search. So overall, it worked pretty well. We were able to detect threatened species using both methods. So BirdNet was able to detect threatened species with the species in its model, and the embedding search worked well as well. When we did detect one of our target species at a site, they were consistently coming out as the best detection from that method. So we didn't have to do a lot of validation to at least confirm site presence at these sites. And throughout this process, we've also now collected over 14,000 new example vocalizations for these 43 species. And so we think these will be very useful for training recognizers for species that perhaps don't have one yet at all. So some of those ones we used the embedding search for, but also hopefully to improve the recognition capabilities of existing models, such as like the BirdNet models, which I'll show you the performance of in a little bit. I obviously won't go through all 43 species or anything, but this is just an example of what this sort of process looks like on an individual species level. So the brown tree creeper has been recently listed as vulnerable. And on the map there, you can see the tan and the green are the predicted habitat locations where brown tree creeper might occur. And so we searched 15 sites for that species, and we detected them at 6 of those, which are those blue dots. And on the other hand, blue-winged parrot didn't have an existing recognizer in BirdNet, and so we used the embedding search. So we had a single vocalization, and we found it at 11 of the 28 sites we searched. So as you can imagine, 28 sites, that was a lot of audio data. And using this method, we were essentially able to reduce that down to a pretty small validation set that was required to actually confirm the presence of that species. But it didn't just work for birds. We could do it with mammals as well. So the koala was one of the mammals we searched for. We got it at 4 of the sites we searched. And also for frogs, we got the Wallam sedge frog at 1 of the 2 sites that it might occur at. Yeah, so we validated a bunch of bird net detections for those species that were present in it, and I just want to, I guess, point out that we still need to validate data that comes out of these models. These plots here show confidence score from the bird net model on the x-axis and the probability of a correct detection on the y-axis. And as you can see, for the brown tree creeper, it works fairly well at really high confidence scores. There's a high probability of a correct prediction. But as we go down to low confidence scores, that drops off quite dramatically. Whereas for the beautiful firetail on Kangaroo Island, for instance, over that same confidence score range, it seemed to reliably only pick out the beautiful firetail vocalizations. So it's still very important that we assess these models and how well they perform before we just sort of use their detections. And while the project was primarily focused on just doing presence absence, I just wanted to point out that using these long data sets like the A2O is collecting, we'll be able to look at temporal trends in the future. This is just brown tree creeper detections at one of the sites in New South Wales over 3 years. And as you can see, there's a peak in detections at the same time every year across these 3 years. So this type of data going forward, I think will be really useful for detecting declines or disappearances or changes in the number of vocalizations we get. And very quickly, just because I did put introduced species in my title as well, I'll briefly mention another project that we've done with an introduced species on Christmas Island. There was a network of sensors deployed there in 2023, approximately 80 sensors. This was primarily set up to monitor threatened species, but we had a student look at detecting an introduced species, the Asian house gecko. So they make a very audible call that's quite distinct. And they've been introduced on the island, and on other islands around the world, they typically have negative effects on native reptiles. So we were interested just to see, could we use acoustics to detect this species, and also where around the island are they distributed and what sort of habitat are they associated with. So we used an embedding search approach as well for this species like we had before. And the student developed an occupancy model from a month of data that he used. And he found them pretty broadly distributed around the island. You can see the green dots are where they were detected and the red dots on that map are where they were undetected. And his model found that they had lower site use where we had high canopy height, and they also had lower site use at high elevations. So we can even do, acoustics for reptiles. So yeah, I just want to finish up and say acoustic monitoring can be useful for threatened and introduced species, and that it's becoming easier and easier to actually process large amounts of data and detect species that you're interested in. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Slade. That was very insightful and interesting. I'd like to hop on to the next speaker. So Karen Rowe from Museums Victoria will be talking about leveraging ecoacoustics data to better understand how birds respond to fire. Karen Rowe is the senior curator of birds at the Museums Victoria Research Institute, and her lab specializes in leveraging ecoacoustics data to document the diversity and distribution of species and how animals respond to ecological disturbances, including fire. So
thanks, Nelli.
All right.
Hi, everyone. I just want to kind of give you an overview of a project that we're really sort of expanding on. It started out as a very different project when we started, but we're really in the last couple of years and particularly in the last 6 months have really broadened our approach to leveraging ecoacoustic data and how we can use that to understand how birds respond to fire and then better manage fire, particularly prescribed burning throughout the state of Victoria. This is a very large collaboration across multiple institutions, primarily with the University of Melbourne. And I've listed some of our collaborators, although a lot of the data was collected by a lot of volunteers as well. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which I work in Melbourne. That's the Woiwurrung, Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung, and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And also pay my respect to First Peoples at the many sites that we survey across the state of Victoria. So just to give you a background on the project, we have a big research program called the Ecosystem Resilience Project. And in 2021, we started collecting data across different ecological fire groups. Those are different vegetation classes within Victoria that are strongly shaped by their responses to fire. We're really interested in looking at how species themselves, and for me particularly bird species, by looking at two different variables of fire. So how long since the last fire, or growth stage since fire, but also how the previous fire to the most recent fire has dictated the response of species, and how they can be used to model where we need to go in the state to meet our burning targets, but also how those burning targets will impact ecological communities. Most of this approach is very species specific, but we're really hoping that our ecoacoustic data will help us move that from species specific to more community level associations. So since 2021, we've collected data at over 1,400 sites within Victoria. Each of these little color blocks is a different ecological fire group. We will be moving into the Lowe and Mallee area this year, so we'll be collecting data on 200 more sites. And these sites are selected based on a strategic sampling of time since fire and last fire interval, and are slightly modified based on accessibility. There are some places that are a lot easier to get to. But as you can see, we have pretty good sampling across much of the state that's easy to get to. So we have a very large data set with which to work with. Now, we're interested in the ecoacoustic data, but this is a really system-wide data collection project. So we are looking at many different habitat variables. We're looking at 11 different ones for habitats. So things like canopy cover, depth of the leaf litter, number of tree hollows, many different structural characteristics within the habitats and sites where we've surveyed. We're also looking at plant diversity, both abundance and species richness. We have cameras deployed here. We have one white flash and one IR camera per site, so we can get an idea of what mammal species are present. And the original survey methodology, this is a very long-running project across the state, was to collect bird data via point counts. But in 2021, we decided to see if we could learn more about the species and what species were present by putting out recorders. And we focused primarily on song meter micros because we have a very large scale project, and we're really looking at just short survey periods. So we were really interested to see, are the acoustic recorders allowing us to better comprehensively sample the bird community, is what it really came down to. And so what we did early on in the project was look at how does our acoustic survey method compare to point counts in terms of the number of species and which species are detected. So we looked at a method where we subset our acoustic data, and we listened to 21 minutes, which is roughly equivalent to a single point count at a site. And we were really interested to see how many species we were recording as we increased the number of sites. So this species accumulation curve. And so you can see from the sort of salmon colored point counts that we are accumulating species, but with the acoustic method where we listen to 21 minutes, we're actually picking up more species more quickly. So it's certainly already improving the number of species that we're detecting at each site. But we also found interesting is the distribution of which species are picked up by which method. It's not surprising to think that one method would be more reliable for one method, or sorry, for some species would be reliably detected in one method or the other. The majority of species were detected by both our ecoacoustic listening methods, but also point counts. But there are still many more species we were picking up with acoustic recorders. And so it really started to highlight to us the importance of being able to incorporate this into the monitoring program that's used across the state. So if we fast forward that to the last couple months, we started using BirdNet in our lab as well. We're really interested to see whether or not improving the detection of species using a multi-species classifier can actually further improve the number of species we are detecting. So those listening surveys are really focused on an individual person listening to about 21 minutes of recordings and then identifying and tagging each of those calls. We know that's a very subset of the data. It's about 99.6% of the data wasn't being reviewed because we didn't have the capacity to review it. But now that we've used just the out-of-the-box BirdNet, we've actually increased the number of species detected further. So that's another 71%. So what you're looking at here, the slope plot showing a subset of our sites where we had listening surveys already done. So we were on average about 20 species per site. And then the comparison of the same sites using the BirdNet model. No modifications really, just to see how many species we could detect. And then each of those detections were validated at a site level. So we were able to confirm that it was indeed that species that was detected. So now the emphasis is going to be on how we can leverage the BirdNet models to look at improving our detection of birds in this huge data set. We do have about, it's not quite, it's about 4 million minutes of recordings, not 4 million hours, but we do have a very large data set with which we can start interrogating to kind of improve the species that we've detected. We now know too at another subset of the sites that BirdNet is good at picking up species that weren't picked up by our listening surveys, but there are still some species that we haven't been able to pick up with BirdNet. So now we're going to go through and figure out, are those species not in the BirdNet model, and then build models for them? Or is it just that the model's not tuned for the species that occur in our region? So it's a very early days for this project, but hopefully I'll be able to share more of it with you at the Ecoacoustics meeting later this year. But we've really already been able to demonstrate that the ecoacoustic data has really improved our understanding of the system. And we're able to detect more species at more sites, which is really just sort of a new way of looking at how we can model species responses to fire. And one of the challenging aspects of this large-scale project is that we have to have a minimum number of species, a number of sites where each species is detected to be able to model it using generalized additive models. And so just based on the reporting rate of the number of species detected and where they're detected, we were able to model 47% more species. So this is really important because generally when we collect these data, we're only able to model about a third of them. And so just by adding more species, we have a better handle on what species are in these habitats and how do they really respond to fire. Another aspect of this is that as a museum scientist, we're really interested in providing permanent records. And so when we have these ecoacoustics data, we do have verifiable records of the surveys that we've made. And then as tools become more available, we're then able to reinterrogate the data and extract more biological information. So this was a really large-scale project. It's still going on. I just want to highlight Bradley Clark Wood and Liam Meredith, who've done the lion's share of validating all that audio data. And then the funding was provided by Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, and then administered through our Department of Environment here, and also financially supported by the Holsworth. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you all the speakers for presenting for us. Next, I'd like to open the floor for open discussion. So any questions for our speakers? If anyone wants to share their ecoacoustics project, we're more than interested to hear about it. I think we can start with a question from the chat. So Daniela Texera is asking Slade, did you look for species beyond their predicted range? Acoustic could be good for updating distribution maps.
Yes, good question. No, we didn't. So we pretty much relied on the range maps that we got from sort of provided by the EPBC. Part of that was, I guess, to keep the validation effort manageable, even though it was still a pretty huge validation effort we did for all those species and all those sites. I'd say typically the trend was we detected most species within, if you think back to that map I showed for some of the individual species, there was a green sort of area on the map and there was a tan area. The green area sort of is the predicted like habitat where they're likely to occur according to the definition, and the tan was where they may occur. So I'd say that most species were showing up within the sites that fell within the green area, I guess more core sort of habitat for them. But there were cases where we did get species, and I think even the brown tree creeper that I showed up was one of them, where they were sort of on the edge. The site was on the edge of the current distribution. So I think it's a good point that we could look, further afield, and it could be very useful for finding out if they're in new locations. And I think because these tools are getting easier and easier to use, we can actually, do that. Whereas before, if you were just listening, you probably would just focus on exactly where you're expecting them to be.
So Caroline Peterson was keen to hear more about Kangaroo Island results. Slade, do you have?
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember full specifics, just with the, 76 species and 63 sites. I definitely forget, particular instances of which ones we got where. But I do know because Kangaroo Island, all the threatened listed species there are typically like a subspecies of sort of a broader distributed species, and they were often in the BirdNet model, as at least at the species level, because they were, I guess, more common species on the mainland, and they have made their way into BirdNet's training data. And so I think pretty much every bird that we searched for there did already exist in the BirdNet model. And I actually think from memory that all the ones we searched for at that site, we actually did get a detection. There's sort of, I think there was like maybe 7 species or 8 species or something there's only one A2O site on Kangaroo Island. I know there's like a little, I think little wattlebird Kangaroo Island subspecies is threatened there. Bassian thrush, I think, is another one. But yeah, in general, we got a number of detections for species there. And like I showed, the beautiful firetail performance of BirdNet was quite good. I can't remember off the top of my head whether all of the Kangaroo Island species were like as good performing out of the BirdNet model. But like I mentioned, we have collected now vocalizations for all those species that we searched for. And while it's not currently out, we're sort of writing up the paper, and like these sort of validated data will end up on the A2O, and models that we're trying to produce out of that will also end up available for anyone to use. So it's sort of not ready to use yet, but there will be, hopefully even better models for those species and improved monitoring for them. Thanks for the question.
Any other questions for our speakers? I was keen to hear a bit more about your work, Karen. Can you say what are your plans? What are you going to do next?
That's a good question. Actually, what we're really trying to, one of the big challenges of this data set is that the Department of Environment has collected survey data in a very prescribed way, and the methodology comparison is kind of where we're stuck right now, is how do we incorporate ecoacoustic data, because now we're going to say, well, we have better detection, so how do we rectify what we've said about those species in the past? That's a big challenge that we're struggling with right now. And then mostly what we're going to be doing is, now that we've created more training data, how can we improve the BirdNet model to help us do a set of sites within Victoria, whether we need to retrain the models for our regional variation. And we have a new postdoc joining us very soon to help us kind of ask those questions. But I'm really interested. So most of the output for this is also species by species. So this species responds to the fire in this way in this community. And we're really interested in, is that site specific? Is that regional specific? Is that ecological fire group specific? There are all these different factors that shape the responses. And we have with the opportunity with ecoacoustic data to really see what's the context in which it shapes the pattern that we see. And I think that's where we're going to go for the next couple of years, is really start to pull apart those data and bring it all into one sort of more cohesive picture of how birds respond to fire, and how context is relevant to that.
Yeah, it is interesting how now that we've got these great AI techniques for understanding the data, we've got BirdNet and Perch, and we can use embeddings and search embeddings for where we've only got a sort of a few, perhaps even one kind of call of the species. It's then opened up a whole lot of other questions around how we kind of combine the data with sort of traditional methods, and what are the sort of the good sort of survey designs and things. So it's wonderful how we used to be sort of tied up and concerned about the hardware, and then we were concerned about the actual analyzing the raw data, and now we're sort of much more concerned about the sort of the downstream questions of how we can actually sort of understand and interpret the data, and what sort of design should we be using anyway for the surveys.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's another comment, isn't it?
Yeah, Caroline's just thanking Slade
Yeah.
for his answer.
So I think we've got a slide later on that sort of advertises. I mean, there are a number of sort of events coming up. There's things like the data weeks coming up. The Turn Science Symposium is coming up. There's the Australian Ornithological Conference coming up in Perth, and just the week before that, we've got the Ecoacoustics Conference, which is also in Perth or close to Perth. So that's another great venue for us to do things. We are keen to kind of continue these webinar series. We're keen to keep them, quite sort of short and focused. So, any feedback that you have on whether these are useful, whether a different format would work, and about particular topics you'd like covered would be really useful.